Hey everybody. So I posted a video a little earlier today and I was skimming through it, rewatching it, and apparently like the streaming got off or something, so it's all messed up. So I'm gonna post this because I don't want you to miss any important information. And feel free to watch the other one. It sort of comes in and out at different spots, and so I apologize. I don't know what happened there. So hopefully this one will be a little better. Okay, so I'm going to quickly recap. Quickly is a relative term around here, but I'm going to recap what I sort of the bigger point I was making as sort of an introduction to my main point of the video. And my main point is just sort of understanding why the INFJ sort of operates the way that they do. But to get there, you sort of have to understand my little personal theory of why the different types sort of evolved in the first place. Okay, so real quick recap on that. So my argument is through evolution, we have all these 16 different types because each type is filling a different role in society or their given culture. Okay. And Jung actually, when he first started talking about this, he sort of makes this point that like you could understand why evolution would want, half introverts, half extroverts, that kind of thing. But the point is that if you think of culture as sort of itself as a big brain or a big computer, it needs different components, and we are the components. The people are the components of the culture doing different things. Because if you have everybody sort of acting the same way, you tip the balance too far in one direction, and if the culture is trying to preserve itself, so sustain itself and also preserve itself or protect itself from outside attacks, if it's too far balanced or too far shifted into one function type or one domain, it's going to expose itself to vulnerabilities in others, right? So it sort of spreads out the different functions across itself, and it does that through the different psychological types. That's my argument. Do I have any evidence for it? No, other than the fact that these psychological types tend to develop in every culture, even if they haven't interacted with each other. At least I think that's the case. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. I think that was Joseph Campbell's point. And so if you're seeing it spread across different cultures, there's got to be something there, right? And whether, it's through biology or intelligent design, that's, whatever, right? But I'm going to talk about it in biology terms or evolution terms, just to, because that's the way I think about it. Okay, so the other sort of point to understand, or main point, is my analogy to the universal staple maker, right? So there's this old, sci-fi short story, or maybe it was just sort of a thought experiment kind of thing, where they're talking about the alignment problem in artificial intelligence. Like, how do you design a AI system or a robot that's not going to just overtake humanity? And the cautionary tale is developing a robot where its sole purpose is to make as many staples as possible, and then it sort of somehow achieves super intelligence, artificial general intelligence. And if its only goal is to make staples, then it starts taking over society and making all the humans into slaves to make staples. And then it eventually realizes it can make more staples if it didn't have to feed all these humans, and so it kills off all the humans. And so you have this one robot that's just like there, like it's the only thing on Earth, and all it's doing is making staples, right? And that's obviously a misalignment with humanity. And the analogy here is, your dominant function is basically your universal staple maker, right? So if you were left to your own devices and you didn't have all the other functions, and you didn't have to sort of interact with other people and live by their rules, you would just basically do whatever your dominant function is programmed to do. Like, that's just you on autopilot, right? And the point being is that through evolution or intelligent design or aliens or whatever, each psychological type was sort of programmed where, that's your dominant function. That's sort of your role in the culture. And it might be a little hard or might not resonate too much in today's society because we have a lot of technology that has taken over the role that some of the psychological types played. But you have to remember, as humans were evolving, we didn't have that technology around. Like, all we had were our brains and, whatever simple tools and stuff we could come up with, right? So our brains had to be the program, running the culture. Okay. So the INFJ, the example, or, using the INFJ as an example. So you've got dominant intuition, introverted intuition, and secondary extroverted feeling. And my argument is that the INFJ, their role in preserving the culture is to serve as the reservoir of knowledge, in particular, the reservoir of knowledge of social things like cultural, social traditions, rituals, history, language, things that keep, the relationships among the people within the culture running. Okay. Um, and, and left to our own devices, all we would do is just acquire knowledge, because most cultures, if they want to sustain past the generation, they need there to be at least a handful of people who know the traditions of the culture and can explain it to the next generation or hand it down to the next generation. And so you need, the handful of people to be that reservoir of knowledge. Okay. And I'm arguing that that's what the INFJ was sort of developed to be. And so a good example would be the Brehons, that's B as in boy, Rehon, in ancient Ireland, where there was this whole class of individuals. I think they were all men, but I could be wrong about that. I don't know. I mean, ancient Ireland was very, women did a lot in ancient Ireland. So I don't know if they were, anyways. But you had this class of people where their role in society was to preserve the culture, right? And they did it through oral tradition. They didn't have anything written down, and they had this very, very, complicated series of laws that was handed down and sort of developed through the cultures. Okay. And they would take, sort of a handful of kids. And I don't know how they selected them. I guess they probably gave them the MBTI test, right? And they would take, this handful of kids and develop them into the next generation of Brehons. So they would spend years and years learning about language, learning about poetry, learning about the law, learning about tradition and culture. And they were just this reservoir of knowledge within the society. Okay. And they'd learn about poetry because it's easier to, tell a story or transmit information through poetry because it rhymes. It's easier to remember, that kind of thing. And so very, very sophisticated body of knowledge, body of laws, but they would also serve, these Brehons would also serve as the judges, so if there was a dispute between neighbors, like one neighbor is saying, my neighbor stole my cows, or my neighbor murdered my son, or something like that, and there's some sort of grievance that they, want to have addressed, the two of them would agree to go to a Brehon, and they would hire this Brehon out, and he was basically serving as a judge. And they'd plead their case, and the Brehon would sort of rely on his body of knowledge, that he acquired through the years, and make some sort of judgment. And the parties would either disagree, or they, found that the Brehon had sort of violated natural law. This is all sort of tied to natural law. if he made a bad judgment and other Bryans could come in and show that he made a bad judgment, then he himself, the judge, would have to pay restitution to whoever got the bad verdict against him. So very, very complicated system, and you could imagine why you would need a particular psychological type of person that's sort of adept at that, because there was nothing in writing until St. Patrick came around and put some of these laws into writing, but it was all just transmitted orally, okay, through generation and generation. Very, very complicated, lots of rules, lots of things they had to do and learn. Okay. And so because of that, and so why were they the INFJs? The INFJs were, again, introverted intuition, so they're just built to be this reservoir of knowledge, and it's not like SI knowledge. It's like developing abstract theories, abstract concepts, being able to link things together that you didn't. If you're a judge, you're going to see, most of the cases you see, they're unique. You've never seen that type of case before, and you have to be able to apply your abstract knowledge about the law and the way that your society is supposed to work, and apply that knowledge to the particular case, right? So it can't just be SI type of knowledge, where you're relying on personal experience. It's more abstract, right? Okay. And the reason it's the INFJs also is because they have that secondary function, extroverted feeling. And that's going to be the important part, or one of the important parts, because my argument is that the secondary function is your means to your end. So if you think of the whole point of the INFJ is to be this reservoir of abstract NI type of knowledge about the society, it has to engage with the environment to acquire that knowledge. And the way it engages is it engages with people, right? So it's either learning from a teacher, it's observing the way that society functions, it's watching people interact. All that FE, NI stuff is, building up that database, but the FE is sort of, again, the means to the end. The point is to build up the knowledge. The FE is just the tool. It's the tool function, right? That the INFJ is using to acquire that knowledge, and in some respects to apply it as well. And so if it is the universal staple maker and its whole point is to acquire knowledge, it's doing it through this engagement function, right? So if you're an INFJ, you're building up your reservoir of knowledge, you're doing it through your FE function. And I'm going to come back to that to really sort of hone down or nail down like why the INFJs sort of work the way that they do, okay? In sort of day-to-day stuff, not just this, building up knowledge kind of stuff. Okay, and then the other example would be like the INTJ, where society not only had social rules and laws and traditions and language and stuff like that it had to pass along, but it also had to figure out how things work, right? It had to figure out, how do you make boats, and how do you predict the seasons by looking at the planetary motion and the stars in the sky and where we are relative to the sun. All that kind of stuff the INTJs were figuring out, right? So they were more focused on the objects, the systems, the process, not so much the social dynamics, but things about how to make weapons, how to make boats, how to predict the seasons, when you plant your crops, when you harvest them, all that kind of stuff is very INTJ stuff, right? And again, they would be sort of the reservoir of knowledge that they would, pass that information down from generation to generation. Okay. Because again, nothing's in writing. So you got to learn it from somewhere, and so that's why INTJs and INFJs sort of have the sort of wizard kind of archetype, because the Brahins, a lot of times they're sort of associated with the Druids in the Celtic culture. and druids are sort of the precursor of, you know, wizards. And so, yeah, getting a phone call here. Anyways, and so the introverted intuition stuff is sort of, you know, the wise old man, or, you know, the wizard, the sorry, the the wisdom of the elders, yeah, is the way to think about it. Sorry about that. I gotta put my phone on just on do not disturb here. Okay, so where am I? All right, so INFJ, INTJ, we're the reservoir of knowledge. And so our fundamental universal staple maker programming is just to go out and acquire as much knowledge as possible. And we don't know why, right? This is why you put us in a bookstore and we will be there for 4 hours going from section to section, reading different books about different topics. And, you know, if you're waiting on an INFJ, good luck to you, you know, because like that is just what we do. We just want to absorb information and about a lot of different things. Now, the INFJ will tend to focus on things that are sort of socially relevant, like history, languages, you know, maybe music, culture, that kind of stuff. MBTI, psychology, all that sort of social, cultural stuff, where the INTJ might focus more on sort of the sciencey, physics, computer programming, all that kind of stuff, but they're all over the place too, right? Because it's like that, you know, line from the Joker in one of the old Batmans when Heath Ledger was the Joker. They asked him, you know, why are you doing this? And he's like, I don't know. I'm like a dog chasing after a car. Like, even if I caught it, I wouldn't know what to do with it, right? Like, we're just literally just these dogs chasing after cars, you know, chasing after information, just trying to acquire and soak up as much information, because there was this, you know, cultural demand way back when, and we're just sort of the byproduct of it, where at least a handful of people throughout society are sort of chosen, so to speak, to be that sort of reservoir of knowledge, right? And that's why, you know, we do it with very little effort, and we, you know, and it puts us in our flow state. Like, there's no better flow state for an INFJ and probably an INTJ of just sitting there and consuming information, right? And, you know, are we ever going to use it? I don't know. Maybe if it comes in helpful. But that's why we're all setting up, you know, YouTube channels, you know, because we've got, you know, decades of information that we've just sort of acquired in little theories like this. That we just, you know, that SE fourth function is like, you know, trying to kick us to put it out there and do something with it. And so, you know, so you see this proliferation of INFJs doing YouTube channels, doing all this kind of stuff, because they just have this knowledge that they want to, you know, share for one reason or another, right? And it's like the other analogy is, you know, I use in my other videos, the border collie, where if you have a border collie, you know, when you take them out on walks and stuff, like, you have to give them something to do. You have to give them a little job, like carry a stick or carry the water, put a little backpack on them or something, because they just need something to do. Why? Because they're programmed to do that, right? You know, they're just evolved as a species, or as a breed to, you know, to be like that. So that's the INFJ, you know, just constantly acquiring knowledge. Now, the other knowledge types, you know, would be your ISFJs and your ISTJs. And they're not so concerned with the big abstract things like planetary motion and, you know, stars in the sky, or, you know, law and justice and tradition. You know, they get some of that, but it's more of sort of the day-to-day, how do you function day-to-day kind of stuff, you know, SI stuff, right? How do you make the tools? How do you make the weapons? How do you make the clothes? How do you prepare the meals? How do you, you know, do all the stuff that you have to do as a culture on sort of a day-to-day logistics kind of basis, right? They're not so worried so much about the abstract part of it and applying knowledge to new situations. They want to just know, okay, this is how you make your clothes. This is how you make your tent. This is how you start a fire. And so the ISTJs and the ISFJs are going to be very good that kind of stuff. And of course, the ISTJs are probably more object focused. The ISFJs are probably more social focused. Like, here's just how the social dynamics work within the culture. And they are going to be that reservoir of just sort of day-to-day knowledge, and they hand that off generation to generation, right? So those are your knowledge-based. And I don't want to get too much into all the different types. I might make a video where I just sort of go through each type. The only other ones I mentioned were like, the deliberative types. So introverted thinkers, lead function, introverted feelers, lead function. They have to deal with sort of new one-off cases where they have to make a deliberation and make a decision, right? So the INFP, it's going to be a good mediator. They're probably sort of involved in the Breton system in some sense as being judges, mediators, figuring out what's fair. It's not just all about them. It's about, sort of the culture and sort of applying, this sort of NE type of, explaining why it's fair and why people should be doing what they're doing, that kind of thing. ISFPs are going to be, they're going to be the ones designing the insignias, designing the patterns that go into your culture's pottery or your culture's, clothing or whatever, so that you can identify who is, with you and who is not. Intruders are a very, very big threat to any culture. And so the ISFPs, like, I think their role was to basically design ways that you could physically tell whether people were in your group or not, right? Jewelry, engravings on tools, all that kind of stuff. And also like where you were in the social hierarchy, that kind of, like based off of visual information. Okay. And then the thinkers, the INTPs were like the calculators, right? Like they didn't have calculators back then. And so if, a warehouse burned down and they had to figure out like, okay, how many barrels did we lose and how many barrels of food do we need to grow again? The INTP is going to do the math. Like they're going to figure out, or, or with an ISTP, be like, well, this ship broke, right? Like there's a leak in the ship. Like, how do we fix it? It's a real time here and now. We got to make a decision on how to sort of apply some sort of knowledge, and make a decision, right? So the FIs are going to be more sort of social decision makers, and the TIs are going to be more sort of object oriented decision makers, or process decision makers, for that one-off stuff, right? And it's not information that's going to be handed down from generation to generation, but if they had like a nice solution to an interesting problem, they might go to their local INFJ or their local INTJ and say, hey, here's how we address this problem. And the INTJ would put it in his little mental bank and pass it on to the next generation. And that's, how the culture's evolved. So that's a very, very simplistic way. Obviously, things are way more complicated than that. That's a very cartoonish, fantasy novel way of looking at personality, where everybody has their little role in their little slot. But if you want to think of, well, why did we evolve these different personalities? That's basically why, right? So that we could solve the competitive advantage problem in economics. That was the term I was trying to think of. If you're a country that's really good at making wine, and then you have another country that's really good at making bread, then you have the country that makes the wine make the wine, and the country that makes the bread make the bread. And they trade with each other, and they're economically better off than if they both tried to make wine and make their own bread, right? So it's the same thing, but with culture and with personality types. Like if everybody was trying to do the same thing and fill the same role, then it's just sort of a waste of resources, right? And you might, have too many people trying to get into, a slot that doesn't need that many people, and you sort of put your culture at risk because you don't have the ISFPs doing what they're supposed to do and the ISFJs doing what they're supposed to do. And and so you're sort of exposing yourself, or not, or you're putting yourself, also might be putting yourself in a position where you can't sustain the culture. You're not passing it down in the way that you could. Okay, so now that's sort of the highlight of my argument of why we've sort of developed these different functions. But so now, to understand the INFJ and sort of the here and now in today's day, because you know the INFJ doesn't need to go around being the reservoir of knowledge anymore, right? Like, we have plenty of, once they came out with writing and books, the INFJ was sort of rendered redundant or irrelevant. But we're still interesting and we're still fun. Um, but we're constantly looking for, we're just that border collie just out on a walk trying to do a job. And so, but understanding that that's sort of our underlying programming will help you understand, when you're engaging with an INFJ, where they're coming from. Okay. So, stepping back again, if the INFJ's function is to store as much knowledge, abstract ideas, theories about cultural, traditional type of things, um, and it does it through this FE interface. Okay. And the FE interface could be activated in a lot of different ways. It can be activated through personal interaction, just talking one on one with people, talking to groups of people. But it also could be just, watching YouTube videos like this, watching people, just random strangers on a train or in a bar, just people watching, and the INFJ is just constantly people watching and constantly trying to acquire more information about people, or as much information as possible, through these different means. But one thing that one mechanism that is, I think, important to understand is, how does the INFJ sort of acquire that information, like mechanically speaking? And I would argue, like the way that I think about it is that we acquire it through putting ourselves into another person's perspective. Okay. And so if we are talking to somebody, we are not thinking like, what information do I want to get out of this person necessarily, right? Or we're not really thinking about ourselves. Like, that whole FI thing is just disregarded. We're not engaging with people on an FI type of basis. Like, we're trying to get something out of it. We are engaging because we want that information from them. And somehow, through evolution, intelligent design, whatever, our brains have created this mechanism that I think is not very well understood, but it is about putting yourself into somebody else's shoes, putting yourself in their perspective. And because it's almost like, the mushrooms or the fungus that will, like, invade an ant's brain and just sort of take over their body. Now, I don't think we're like like actually taking over anybody's brain, but we are trying to put ourselves into their brain in a very, bear with me, I'm going to try to explain what I'm talking about. And so the analogy that I think of is, when I'm playing chess, when I play chess, I'm more concerned about what the other person is doing than what I'm doing, right? The other person's trying to do something to me, and I'm going to react to that and try to push them off their game and try to push them into, you know, like, they're heading down one path and I want to push them into a different path, right? Um, and I don't know if that's a winning strategy. It probably isn't, but that's the way that, I think an INFJ sort of thinks about it. Or think of it like a defensive coordinator in football, right? Like, you're trying to defend against something. And so you're putting yourself in the other person's perspective, right? Like, what are they trying to do to you? And so you try to get into their head and figure out what their goals are, what they're trying to accomplish. And then it helps you, A, just gather information about them, and B, try to push them into a different way of thinking, a new line of thinking. Okay. So um, there's this former CIA agent who been on some podcasts, and one of the guys, and I'm pretty sure this guy's an INFJ because he gives the most INFJ answer to this question. One of the guys asked him, what makes a good CIA agent? And he was like, yeah, anytime you're interacting with somebody, whether you're, trying to recruit them or you're interrogating them or whatever, that you have to be able to look at it from their perspective, try to figure out what they want out of the situation and not just what you want. That is a very INFJ type of approach. And when you're dealing with an INFJ, like if you're arguing with them or you're having a conversation, just a normal conversation, you have to understand they are trying to put themselves into your head. Right? Like the reason that the types of questions that we ask, the types of things that we're trying to get at is we are trying to get into your head. Right. And again, I think this is an evolutionary thing where when our role was to pass abstract NI knowledge from generation to generation, we developed this way of getting in somebody else's head to extract the information from them so that we can acquire it and pass it down. Now, that sounds very woo-woo and metaphysical. I'm not trying to say we're like, literally inhabiting, like being John Malkovich or something, literally inhabiting somebody else's head. But when we're thinking about something, we're not thinking from our perspective, we're thinking from their perspective, because it's the best way to get the information out of them, right? So one thing you'll notice, like if you're arguing with an INFJ, they very rarely argue from their own FI, like, you pissed me off and you did this, and this is what I want, you're not like, they're not coming from an FI perspective. They are going to come from a, what did you think you were doing, when you did that? Like, what were you trying to accomplish by doing such and such? Like, were you thinking, like, they literally are trying to figure out, and it's not like some smart ass, like, are you an idiot kind of question. We're literally trying to figure out, like, what were you thinking? Why are you taking, why do you disagree with me on this? Why are you taking another position? Because if I could figure out why you're taking another position, I can start shifting you off the path that you're on, right? And so if you're going down one path and I can figure out, oh, this is their angle, this is where they're coming from, I can try to move you to another path, right? So I care way more about what you think about the situation than what I think about the situation, okay? Now, I sort of know the end goal I'm trying to achieve, just like everybody does, but I'm not arguing from like a position of strength. I'm not trying to, it's not a war of attrition. I'm not trying to go out and, manhandle or apply my will to the situation. What I'm trying to do is get into your head and get you to think about it the way that I'm thinking about it, or to think about it differently. And to me, that's a much more effective strategy, but other people can disagree, right? I mean, the ESTP is just going to beat you down, just say you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. Or maybe the ENTP or the INTP will just keep arguing the logic of the situation, but they're not trying to get into your head. They're just trying to convince you that whatever you told them is not adding up or making sense. Where the INFJ is like, well, okay, I don't really care about all that stuff so much as I just want to know what your perspective is. And if I can get into your head, then, we can sort of maybe redirect the conversation to something more constructive or whatever, right? So that's why INFJs make great negotiators. Now, not litigators, because litigators is about like going to court and suing people, all that kind of stuff. That's more of a show of force, a show of will. It's more of attrition a lot of times. But like real negotiation, where you're trying to come up with a reasonable solution to a reasonable problem, contracts, employment agreements, that kind of stuff. If you can see it from their perspective, like what are they trying to get out of it, then you can acknowledge, like, okay, I understand where you're coming from. I understand you're trying to go down this path, but I can't go all the way down that path. You got to meet me halfway, that kind of thing, right? And it's not about me. It's about you. What do you want out of it? What are you going to get out of it? And how can we make you happy without giving up everything on our end, right? Like you can't be too much of a pushover. All you INFJs out there. And so it's a very different way of negotiating. It's not just like, oh, this is the way we always do it, or this is the way the market does it. That's kind of a pretty standard way of negotiating contracts. But the INFJ is going to really try to figure out, like, okay, where is this person coming from? So we make good negotiators in that respect, or maybe mediators, coming up with a reasonable solution to a reasonable problem. And really just anything where, just sort of acquiring information, but being able to apply it from somebody else's perspective. And they always say INFJs make good counselors. And we do on sort of a direct, like friend to friend, family member to family member. Not entirely sure how good we are in sort of a professional setting, because we can't help ourselves from trying to get in the other person's head and redirecting them. And you're not really supposed to do counseling like that. I don't know. Maybe they changed the rules since I was in grad school. But okay, so now that being said, if you are arguing with an INFJ and they start arguing from an FI perspective, right? They start arguing like, you are hurting my feelings. You are, making me upset, kind of FI, getting their FI out there. If you're arguing with an INFJ and they start doing that, that's when you want to leave the room, right? Because INFJs, that's when you've pushed them too far. When they start dipping into that FI and start exerting that FI onto you, in the way that maybe some other types would, now some lines have been crossed, right? Now, whether or not, you agree that, that you crossed the line or not, but from the INFJ's perspective, something triggered. And it's best to just leave the room and let it settle and let them figure out, like, again, the INFJ is going to reel back that FI and they're going to try to figure out, okay, how can I engage with this person that I'm arguing with and try to get them to sort of see it from my perspective, or, meet me halfway kind of thing. Okay. So I think that's about it. Again, it's just understanding, and it's very hard to articulate. And I don't know if it's making any sense for anybody other than the INFJs out there. The INFJs are all like nodding their head, like, yeah, totally. But everybody else is probably like, what? But think about it as like the reason that we do it that way, the reason that we try to put ourselves in the other person's perspective, is because that was sort of our sole function through sort of evolutionary time. We've been programmed to try to acquire as much information as possible, for the good of the culture, the good of the society, so that we can pass it on. And so our way of doing that is by putting ourselves into other people's perspective. Like if we're watching people at a bar and we're just, sitting there and two strangers are talking across the room, like we are literally thinking of what conversation they're having, right? Like we are mentally trying to transplant ourselves into their head. Like what are they talking about? And maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong, but that's what we're doing. And I don't know if everybody else really does it in the same way. And again, nothing metaphysical going on here, no woo-woo being John Malkovich kind of stuff, but it's just, I mean, there really are neurons in the brain called mirror neurons, where if you record activity from the mirror neurons, if you got a monkey or a person watching another person do something, like pick up a cup or dial some numbers or, reach out, grab an object, you're going to have mirror neurons in the monkey that's not doing any action, just watching it happen. Those mirror neurons start firing as if the monkey is making the action itself, right? And it's in the motor cortex and all, or like by the motor cortex. And so we learn, INFJs and just everybody learn information about things, about people, by observing, and then we sort of replay it in our head as if we were doing it, right? And for whatever reason, the INFJ just tunes into that perspective shifting. Why? Because we have this universal staple maker that's just trying to acquire as much information as possible, and we just can't help ourselves. And so any sort of interaction you're having, whether it's a pleasant conversation, they're just trying to extract information out of you. Or if you're arguing with them, they're trying to extract information out of you. And that's just what we're doing, right? And if we shift into a different mode where we're exerting our will and we're not trying to extract information, we're trying to tell you what's what, that's when you leave the room, right? And just let them simmer, because, at that point, there's no convincing them, or you just, you don't know what to expect, right? Okay. So that's it. I'd be interested in your thoughts, especially INFJs out there. INTJs, it's kind of the same thing, but they're more object oriented. So they're going to be trying to acquire information and stuff, but more from interacting with objects and computer programming and doing that kind of stuff, and less about trying to interface with people. So, okay, cool. Let me know what you think, and I'll be back probably a little later with some other stuff I felt like talking about. So hopefully this one recorded without any sort of technical problems. All right, cool. Talk to you later. Bye.